Hi everyone, my name is Joanna and I'm an autistic neuroscientist currently in the third year of my PhD. And today I'm going to be talking about autism. So, autism has been a popular talking point recently and has unfortunately been very misrepresented in the media as well as by some public figures who have been spreading blatant misinformation. So, in an effort to combat that, I'm going to start off by explaining what autism actually is before moving into some myth busting. And it's my hope that by the end of this video, you'll have gained some insight and have a better understanding of autism as a whole. So, to start us off, autism is a neurological difference that affects how people perceive the world, learn and communicate, relate to others, and interact with their environments. Autism is what's known as a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition, meaning the neurological differences are present from birth. And while signs often appear in early childhood, many people aren't diagnosed until adolescence or even adulthood due to historical gaps in understanding that I'll get into later in this video. Autism is also what's known as a neurotype, which is an innate cognitive profile that determines how a brain fundamentally works and experiences the world. Some other examples of neurotypes include things like ADHD, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, dyslexia, or Tourette's syndrome. We can think of brains as each being unique computers with various programs installed and files saved that can represent individual experiences, memories, and learned skills. Neurotypes are kind of like the operating system or the OS of a brain. So, similar to how your computer might run Mac, Windows, or even Linux, neurotypes are central to how information is processed by default. So, for example, some systems might rely more on raw sensory data, while others rely more heavily on prediction. And there might be differences in how quickly models of the external world are updated. So, in the same way that a Mac isn't just a broken PC, none of these operating systems or neurotypes are inherently better or worse. They're just different and optimized for different conditions. And just like with specialized computers, difficulties can arise when forced to operate in environments designed for different systems or brains. So, all of this to say that autistic brains aren't broken or wrong, but rather just different, and that comes with different strengths and styles. While every autistic person is different, research has identified some common characteristics. These include sensory processing differences, so how someone experiences things like sounds, lights, textures, or other sensory inputs. Repetitive movements, behaviors, or self-soothing activities like stimming that can help with emotional and physical regulation. Intense focus or deep interest in specific topics that are often called special interests and can even become areas of expertise. A preference for predictability, structure, and routines, which can provide comfort and reduce anxiety, as well as differences in social communication and interactions, which can include things like verbal or nonverbal cues, maintaining conversations or relationships, and understanding unwritten social rules. A common misconception and outdated view is that autism exists on an oversimplified linear scale like the one shown here that ranges from less autistic to more autistic. However, this fundamentally misrepresents what autism actually is. Instead, the term spectrum is referring to something a bit more like this, which better reflects how an autistic person may experience varying strengths and support needs across different realms of life, such as in perception, attention, or sensory processing. It should be pretty obvious that this graphic is a lot more complex than the one I showed you on the last slide, but it's still only scratching the surface of autism's true nature and complexity. That being said, there's a lot more than one or even two ways of being autistic, and in reality, the range and diversity of autistic experiences is very broad. For example, one autistic person might need support with motor skills or executive function, but not communication, while someone else might excel at those things but struggle with, say, social connection or emotional regulation. So, the main takeaway that I want you to get from this is that autism is different from everyone and can vary greatly from person to person. However, you might notice some trends, especially among families or friend groups, as birds of a feather do tend to flock together. For example, many of my autistic colleagues have relatively similar strengths and challenges, which likely contributed to why we all ended up in a neuroscience PhD program. But just like a fingerprint or snowflake, our profiles are still completely unique to each of us. There's even a phrase that says if you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person. You may have heard in the news that autism diagnoses are on the rise, with some people even going so far as to incorrectly claim that we're experiencing a so-called autism epidemic. But this terminology is both inaccurate and harmful. While it's true that the data shows increasing rates of diagnoses, such as this graph on the screen depicting the increase in diagnostic rates between the years 2004 and 2022, this increase is reflective of improved recognition and understanding of the condition, not a true epidemic, and it's actually a terrible misuse of the word epidemic. There's a number of factors that contribute to this rise. The first has to do with the historical context. Although we're pretty certain that autism has existed throughout the course of human history, the formal recognition of it is very recent in the grand scheme of things. The first person ever diagnosed with autism was Donald Triplett, who was diagnosed in 1943 by Dr. Leo Connor. Donald received his diagnosis just 83 years ago, and he unfortunately passed away about 3 years ago. But this means that all of the people who have ever been formally diagnosed with autism throughout all of human history, excluding just the past 3 years, were diagnosed during the lifetime of a single person, which is pretty crazy to think about. This also means that many of you probably know someone who was alive before autism was even recognized as a real condition, meaning generations of autistic people went undiagnosed and were never given an explanation for why they felt so inherently different. For many decades, it was also incorrectly assumed that only boys and men could have autism. It wasn't until about the 1970s that the reality that girls and women could also be autistic began gaining traction. So, given the relative newness of its formal recognition, it makes sense that there's still a lot of catching up to be done. While autism is likely not a new phenomenon, our understanding and ability to recognize and diagnose it certainly is. While the more widespread recognition of autism has only really grown in recent decades, the diagnosis of things like intellectual disability dates back much further. If we look at the graph on the left, you'll notice that since the early 2000s, autism diagnoses shown in blue have been steadily increasing. At the same time, diagnosis of intellectual disability, as shown in yellow, have been declining. This reciprocal relationship is not a mere coincidence, but instead suggests that some individuals who in the past might have been lumped into the category of intellectually disabled are now more accurately being recognized as autistic. This is especially true for autistic people with very high support needs, sometimes referred to as level 3 or profoundly autistic, which typically includes individuals who may be non-speaking and or have IQs below 50. The graph here on the right adds to this understanding, as we see that the diagnosis of profound autism in green at the bottom has leveled off for the most part, while in contrast, the rates of non-profound autism have continued to climb. So, if we were truly in a quote unquote autism epidemic, wouldn't we expect to see the rates of profound and non profound autism to both be rising? Yeah, probably, but that's not at all what we're actually seeing. Instead, the data suggests that lower supports needs autistics, who might not present in the more historically defined or stereotypical ways, are now getting diagnosed more readily. So, in other words, with the recent increases in both understanding and recognition, the spectrum has widened or grown broader in all directions, and more individuals are being identified as autistic today who would likely have gone completely unrecognized in earlier generations. And if we think of it, many of us probably know someone in our family or communities who, if they had grown up in today's age, would almost certainly have received an autism diagnosis. So, once again, it's not that anything has changed about the actual people, it's more that our classification and ability to recognize them as being autistic has improved. Another major reason for the apparent increase is that in 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM-5, redefined the autism spectrum to include several developmental profiles that were once diagnosed separately, meaning that previously people would receive separate diagnoses for Asperger's, PDD-NOS, or childhood disintegrative disorder. But now, these are all grouped together and recognized as different presentations of a more unified autism spectrum disorder. This reclassification meant that people who already had these different diagnoses are now counted in the statistics for autism, thus further contributing to the apparent increase in rates. As I've already alluded to, another big reason we're seeing autism diagnoses rise is simply due to greater awareness and understanding of the condition, as well as improved access to various services, including diagnostic screenings. To break this down a bit more, families, educators, and healthcare providers now have more training than ever, which makes them better able to recognize the signs or traits of autism. This includes pediatricians now routinely screening toddlers during well child visits using various standardized tools, though it's not like there's a blood test or a particularly simple or straightforward way to diagnose autism. We've also seen a big shift in representation, with autism being talked about more openly in the media, schools, and in communities, which has drastically reduced the associated stigma and makes it easier for people to recognize and accept traits in themselves or others, as well as feel more comfortable seeking out a formal diagnosis. On top of that, there's now greater recognition and acknowledgement that autism often co-occurs or is comorbid with other conditions, such as ADHD, OCD, or anxiety. For example, until the 2013 revision to the DSM, people couldn't be diagnosed with both autism and ADHD, meaning that even if someone met the criteria for both, clinicians were forced to pick just one. That change alone opened the door for more accurate diagnoses because, as it turns out, it's not only possible for autism and ADHD to co occur, it's actually incredibly common, with up to 70% of autistic people also having ADHD, myself included. Additionally, in the past couple decades, access to various services have greatly expanded, though there's still definitely room for improvement. These expansions include early intervention programs, school-based support groups, and developmental screenings. These systems are catching kids earlier, making sure they're not falling through the cracks, and helping more families get connected to care. Altogether, these changes have made it much more likely that people across the spectrum are recognized and diagnosed when compared to previous generations. However, despite this increase in awareness and recognition, there are still a number of groups that remain underdiagnosed for a variety of reasons. Take women and girls, for example. Autism is still more often recognized in boys, in part because of gendered stereotypes that historically defined the diagnostic criteria. Boys with special interests in things like trains or computers are more readily flagged as stereotypically autistic, while girls with special interests in things like fashion, makeup, or cooking may be dismissed as just being really into womanly hobbies. On top of that, it's no secret that girls are often socialized more than their male counterparts to hide certain emotions like anger or frustration. This can extend into other realms and result in the masking or concealing of their autistic traits so others are less likely to notice. People of color and racial minorities also face unique challenges and are often underdiagnosed due to racial biases that can lead to the misdiagnosis of something like a behavioral disorder when really it's just autism. Diagnostic criteria and services remain heavily focused on childhood presentations of autism, making obtaining a diagnosis in adulthood significantly more difficult and unlikely. And as I mentioned when talking about girls and women, some individuals of any gender may mask their autistic traits either consciously or subconsciously, making it so that the so-called telltale signs are less apparent to clinicians. And finally, people living in rural or low-income communities face even more practical barriers, including fewer specialists or diagnosticians, long wait lists, and high financial costs. It's also important to note that these barriers can overlap and compound on one another in a way that emphasizes their intersectionality. For example, this explains why a woman of color from a rural or low income background is far, far less likely to get diagnosed than, say, a young white boy with wealthy parents and easy access to specialists. So it's not that the prevalence is genuinely lower in these marginalized groups, it's more that they are less easily able to actually access a diagnosis. And as all these barriers I've mentioned continue to be lowered through better training, broader criteria, and easier access to services, we shouldn't be surprised if the rates of diagnosis continue to rise. So, all of this to say that it's not an epidemic, it's recognition. And it's not a surge, it's catching up. And just because we've been noticing and recognizing more data points doesn't mean that they didn't exist before. There's actually a growing body of evidence supporting the idea that actual rates of autism have been incredibly stable throughout history. So, yes, even though rates of diagnosis are in fact rising, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and neither is getting a diagnosis. Receiving a diagnosis can actually be liberating, not limiting. A diagnosis can lead to access to accommodations and support services that can significantly improve and maintain the well being and quality of life for autistic folks. This includes educational accommodations like extra time on tests or even sensory breaks, mental health care tailored to neurodivergent needs, and the recognition that standard approaches designed for neurotypical brains may not work as effectively for neurodivergent folks. Legal protections under disability rights laws, including workplace accommodations and anti-discrimination protections. Greater self-understanding, which helps people make sense of their experiences and consequently develop effective coping strategies. And importantly, the ability to find community with other neurodivergent individuals. One excellent example of this is the Neurodiversity Alliance at the University of Oregon, which is a student group that demonstrates how recognition and diagnoses can connect people to supportive communities where they can really grow and thrive. Another example is an organization that I'm one of the founding members of, which is the Neurodiversity Innovation Center for Excellence in Neuroscience, or NICE in Neuro, which strives to foster a welcoming and supportive environment for autistic and neurodivergent students, faculty, and researchers within the field of neuroscience. I'd like to conclude by emphasizing that people who receive an autism diagnosis can and do live rich, fulfilling lives. Better recognition leads to better support, and that's fundamentally a good thing. And there's really no need to be afraid of increasing rates of diagnosis. I'd like to end with a reminder that we should always be critical of the information and media we're consuming and try our very best to steer clear of misinformation or fear mongering, especially in the current political climate. And when in doubt, we should turn towards, not away from autistic folks. And remember the phrase, nothing about us without us. And that's the end of this video. Thank you all for watching. Bye.